Hello again. This is the CDH Dad.
And the CDH Warrior.
And we welcome you once again back to Mondays on Mondays. Again, we'll kind of give you the understanding that Mondays on Mondays is based on the fact that our name is Monday. So we are 2 Mondays on Mondays, which is how we came up with that. The other is the disclaimer that we have, which is that we are not medical professionals. We don't have any medical background, nursing background, psychology background, any of that. What we have is just almost 3 decades of experience in CDH. And from that, we're wanting to utilize this forum to be an outlet for the awareness on CDH and the aplastic anemia,
graft versus host disease as well,
and children, because as I've explained in some of the previous episodes, my son was a CDH, congenital diaphragmatic hernia. My daughter developed aplastic anemia, and then after a stem cell transplant had graft versus host disease. So my family is well aware of how to live with children that have special health requirements and how to deal with that in the real world. So that's the reason we have this. So thank you once again for joining us.
And with that, let's roll the title.
And let's start off with this segment. And we basically try and take feedback that we get from the different social media outlets that are available, systems that we're involved with the CDH awareness Facebook site, with aplastic anemia, with graft versus host disease, some of those. It's also one that we do have a email address, which you see in the little
it should
video
be right down here
that you'll see on the screen here.
It is.
So it's
Mondays on Monday 4, the number 4, at gmail.com.
Okay. So that way you can contact us if you've got specific comments or questions. Because part of this is we want this to be an open forum. I will apologize a little bit for the way I sound today. I ended up with a cold this last week and have been trying to recover from it, and I'm just now able to really get up and move around. So I'm feeling better, but I'm sounding still pretty bad, so apologize for that. One of the topics that we talked about for today is discussing, if you have a CDH child, or if you have a child with some type of special needs, the medical community and the doctors, the hospitals, are going to work immediately to take care of that condition and that issue. If it's CDH, they're going to see about how do we deal with repairing the diaphragm, get the breathing back, and they will do some to try and help make sure that there is feeding, so that you've got, at least you can breathe and eat.
Yeah.
2 basic important things in life. With aplastic anemia, it was one of, we had to go through the bone marrow transplant, but then there were some other things along with that, and what we were not prepared for was graft versus host disease, which developed. So part of the parent and the family's responsibility is to kind of be the eyes and the ears, and kind of keep a watch on what is going on in your child's life, to try and see, okay, what are things that we need to bring to the attention of the therapists, the doctors, the medical community, ask questions about over time, and what do we need to bring up that they discuss on this. I was looking at, I think, a chart that you'd put up a week or so ago, that there's I think 1,600 CDH births a year.
Yeah.
So when you consider that, it's a small number that are out there. And you're not going to have medical professionals that are going to know what to look for because each case is different.
1,600, and then you do the rough count that only about 800 survive.
Right.
If you do the rough math, because it's about 50% global survival rate.
Right. So, it's a small community. It is getting larger because the success rate, survival rate is getting better. But it's still a small group. So it becomes necessary for a parent to become pretty much an expert on a lot of things about the condition, but also on the conditions of their child. In terms of CDH and the skeletal issues, I don't know that there's a statistic on this or not, but a pectus is fairly common with CDH. And basically it's sunken chest. It's just a
basically
impression.
it's a deformation of the chest cavity and
The sternum is
sternum basically being compressed. You're born that way, and it slowly gets worse over time.
And part of that is most likely due to the fact that, if you don't have the normal lung development, and you don't have the diaphragm, you don't have that expansion in that area, so the bone just kind of grows a different direction.
And I'll point this out. I thought this was an interesting statistic. I don't remember the exact number for this, but I think it's somewhere around 80 to 90% of people with a pectus are men.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I was going to bring up is that a good friend of mine has a pectus.
Had the surgery to repair it.
Had the surgery to repair it.
It sunk back in.
He had the surgery to repair it, which is basically they just take the sternum out, flip it around, try to get it to come back out, reattach it. And it really did not make that big a difference. It actually sunk back in. So these are some of the things you kind of look and watch at. The other is you consider, it may be some concern because, you look different than other kids, but we all look different in one way or another. So how do we deal with that? So, you learn to be different. And
I want to point something else out. Since we're discussing skeletal defects, it's one, we're not going to go into the spine yet, but with where our patch, depending on whether we were patched or just having muscle stitched together, a lot of times it's stitched to the rib cage.
Right.
And that can cause a deformation of the rib cage.
Yeah. On
the left or right side, depending on what side your the hole was originally on.
Yeah. But that's one that's fairly obvious early in development, and you can work to see what the doctors suggest, and just making sure that the lung function is good, those type of things. Yep. And those are the things you'll need to keep a watch on for yourself and with your doctor. One of the other things that does develop, and we noticed it probably pre-elementary, was the development of the curvature and scoliosis. Yep. It seems to be fairly common with CDH. But it's one that I would suggest that parents go through a framework check. We talked previously about a systems check to check the cardiopulmonary system, to check the GI tract. But then there are also points in time of development and growth that you need to check the bones and the framework and make sure that the skeletal structure is not having problems. Probably pre-elementary school is a good time to talk with your doctor about this, with your pediatrician, and say, hey, do we need to do an x-ray? Do I see any twisting, bending, curvature of the spine? They can do some in-office tests on that just to see if they see anything that's out of line. Again, when the child is entering the puberty time period, in that tween stage, because that's another growth phase, and that's going to affect how things will develop. So you want to, again, talk with a doctor, kind of go through, make sure that everything looks right, and if there are issues, get recommendations and advice on what to do on those
what
aspects.
To do, who to see.
Right. And then I would look at the same thing in around 16 to 18 years old.
Yeah.
At about the time that growth is about to complete, and you see where that is. And then also probably in the late 20s, mid to late 20s is a good time to do that, because some people will continue to grow up until their mid-20s. So if you do a last check of the skeletal around 25 to 27, somewhere in that age range, just so the doctor has had a chance to look and address any concerns that are there and work from that. So those are the type of things that we want to bring up in this group, is that you've got to think about the overall growth and development. You may go through the CDH, you may go through aplastic anemia, you may go through bone marrow transplant, those type of things. But then you want to consider on the longer term, what are other things that you need to look at and address?
Well, and I know I normally focus on CDH, but I want to bring up something about the aplastic anemia, because most people don't think about this. But once you've gone through aplastic anemia as a child, between the transplant, the radiation, and chemo, it changes the bone structure. It can actually cause the bones to become brittle if you're not careful.
Well, that's the thing, is for situations like that, and then just to give a general overview with aplastic anemia, the cure is typically requiring a bone marrow transplant, which requires a heavy chemo treatment to basically eliminate the immune system, and then total body irradiation to take care of the immune system. And in that total body irradiation, it can do damage to the organs and to the skeletal. Yeah. And it may cause issues, in our case, my daughter was less than 2 years old when this occurred. She ended up being short. Now, was
I'd love
the fact
to ask
that
the question of how much of that was genetics and how much of that was the issues with the aplastic anemia.
And that's where the question is her height a factor of the radiation, or is it a factor of genetics? And that's something we won't necessarily know.
We'll never know an answer to that question specifically.
But those are the type of things that you want to at least be able to raise the questions and ask those with your doctors and your medical providers and people that you trust, to say, hey, what about this? What about that? What about these things that you need to deal with? So, like I said, in general, that's just kind of the overview. Is there anything else we needed to discuss on the skeletal? I'm trying to think of anything else that would be a concern. I know people that have genetic CDH sometimes do have skeletal
problems.
Problems.
With CDH, you can have genetic skeletal issues. It depends on what kind of syndrome you have with it. Mine was not considered part of the syndrome.
No, we didn't identify a syndrome with yours. It seemed to be pretty isolated, but
I'm not honestly sure as far as the CDH.
What issues? Yeah.
what all the skeletal issues can be. I know I've seen children with clubbed feet as a result. Probably genetics, but also somewhat tied into CDH.
CDH, yeah. So
I didn't know.
Yeah. So those are things to look at, and like I said, we try and address more with CDH and with aplastic anemia because those are items that we're familiar with and we've been through. But there are other health issues that come up in early childhood, childbirth, those times, that can have longer term effects that you need to just keep a watch on the development of the child, see if anything looks out of the ordinary, and determine, what questions to ask your medical provider on a regular basis about those type of things. So, anyway, I think that's a very brief but topic this week on the skeletal issues, and we appreciate you joining us for Mondays on Mondays once again.
Have a great day. We'll see you next week.